thanks for all the reminders, whoever is doing that. So, I think this documentary touches many different aspects of child's life, a lot of the different issues we see. And I, as a child psychiatrist, see in my work definitely are relevant to some of the things that they have showed. We are definitely seeing a higher rate of anxiety, depression in our children and teens, and certainly that has been the impetus for me to kind of start this foundation called Taarika Foundation, whose mission is to create mental health awareness. And when I saw this documentary, I felt like, there are different changes that the kids are, facing these days. They're growing in a very different world than you and I did. So those factors definitely add to the stress of why their life has been, so different, and maybe adds to the anxiety and fears and stuff. But I also feel like the pressures that they feel these days are way different than we felt at least when I was growing up. I grew up in India, where there is definitely a lot of focus on education, and that's your gateway to career and life, is kind of the general kind of thinking. But I compared that to my daughter, who's a junior in high school, and the stress she faces these days, and how much pressure the kids are feeling to get into a good college, and the culture around them. They're constantly breathing in and out. How many APs, how many extracurriculars will I do? And I think when they shared Savannah's story in the documentary, it kind of touched some of the things that I'm seeing with some of the teens I work with. And so that's why I felt this was kind of relevant to bring it to our Bay Area community. We have so many high achieving parents in our area who certainly have high expectations from their kids, but we also need to take a step back and reevaluate at what cost are we going to have them meet those expectations. So I'll shut my mouth about my perspective on the documentary, and I have amazing panelists who are going to share their thoughts. So my first question is actually to Manuela, who's a parent, wearing the parent hat today. So as a parent, what are the first words that come to your mind after viewing this film?
So the first two words, the first two feelings that came to mind as I was watching this were concern and sadness. And I was there for a very long time. As I continued to watch the movie, though, that sadness kind of developed to a sense of emptiness for these kids' lives, which is kind of contradictory because we're talking so much about achievement, but what kind of achievement and how meaningful is that? So I got that sense of emptiness and of disappropriation, because it's almost like performance without the impulse for it or without the personal drive for it. Definitely perfectionism was a thought that came up in my mind as I was listening to that, and this push for this ideal of perfection or of correctedness that by what standards, by whose choice, I think is always a question that we need to ask ourselves. And then finally, a sense of ambiguity, and even to a certain extent hypocrisy, in the sense that we say that we want empowered, curious, creative, free thinkers, and yet we raise them to be compliant, high-performing reproducers, robots of existing models. And so how do you find that? How do those two things come together? They don't, right? You're either doing one thing or you're either doing another. So those were my initial thoughts as I watched the movie.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that perspective. It resonates with me for sure, and hopefully it resonates with a lot of our other parents who are watching this and participating in our panel. My next question is to our other parent, Shruti. What childhood experiences do you feel best prepared you for life as an adult? And there's a second part to that question also. What experiences do you recall from your own childhood that were most fulfilling?
Very interesting, reflective sort of question. I think the nicest part about my childhood that did really help me prepare was my school, which was not just based in academics. There was a lot of music, creativity, music, singing, poetry, dancing, not as extracurricular, but as part of curriculum. So every day we had music, every day we had art, and then the third aspect was community service. It was a very big part of me growing up. And so success to me came to be defined as, of course, you had to do your work, and that translates into the work I do professionally. But it also translates into being able to write that poem or painting the fall leaf. And a day is incomplete if I haven't actually found an opportunity to help. So just the way success is defined for me personally is more than just being successful at work, but it kind of gave me, just because I did this every day as part of my learning and part of living like life in that particular way, the perception of success changed. And also I started looking at myself, not just in my immediate family, but the perspective of me being part of something bigger. It's not just about me and my family, but it's about the earth. It's about my friends. It's about the community. And that translates into my value system now. So I think that was very, very helpful growing up.
Thank you for sharing that, Shruti. It really is humbling to know that you had a kind of a pretty balanced, sounds like, exposure to not just the academic focus, but creativity, music, and then the larger kind of, give back or being part of the community. And looks like you're showing that value by being on the PTO. So thanks for sharing that perspective. So we'll now move to our professionals in terms of professionals in the mental health field. Sarah, how do you define a good childhood? What's your idea about what's a good childhood?
That's a tricky question to answer just because there's no one concrete answer as to what a good childhood is. I think that there's so many different factors that play into what contributes to a good childhood. Definitely, I think that culture, our environment, the community that we live in, who's around us. I think about the needs of children and stuff like that, and whether or not they're being met. I also think about this kind of this theme about balance that I kind of noticed in the film as well. Balancing academics and extracurriculars, and also this downtime. That those are all things that I was thinking about when it comes to this question. I even thought about like ages and stages too, because we all go through different ages and stages as we go through life. And I think my definition of a good childhood would differ from when I was a teenager, and it might differ again when I become a parent myself. When I was thinking about my own childhood, I was just thinking about the balance part being, what kind of made my childhood so great was that my parents did a good job of, making sure that it was balanced, that I had time for school, I had downtime and opportunities to be social with friends and neighbors. I also, played sports, and I, did Girl Scouts and all these things. And I think that that's just what made my childhood feel pretty great, was just, having this balance of things. And I think my definition of a good childhood will continue to evolve over time.
That makes sense. It's really good to hear that you had that balance. And do you see that balance has been shifting lately for other kids that are growing up now?
I like to think so. I think that there are still, still some children still struggling with the issue of, finding that balance. And I think we're continuing to work on it, as a community. And, it's really great that we're having these conversations so that as parents, as a community, we can work on it together.
Thank you, Sarah. So over to you, Renee. Your question is, what does it mean for a child to be successful? It's a kind of a loaded question, I guess. Shruti kind of shared her idea about how she started to understand what success means to her based on her experience. What's your kind of professional perspective on this?
Sure, I really agree with what Shruti and Sarah said. It's individual, it's culturally informed. I'm going to speak a little bit from my research and my clinical perspective. So I wanted to highlight a few characteristics that stand out to me when thinking about a successful childhood, and briefly discuss what I think should not be a part of this discussion. So I feel like a child is and can be successful when they are unconditionally loved, when they're connected and engaged to their family and or community, teachers, other trusted adults, and their passions and interests, when they are known and understood and can exhibit resilience, grit, and a growth mindset. So those last three terms have a huge amount of research behind them, but I wanted to just focus on resilience a little bit tonight. It's a powerful trait, and the need for it shows up really frequently in childhood. And what it may look like for your students is a child who can take a deep breath, think something very kind to themselves, ask for help or take a break, and then continue engaging in the task, even though it's challenging and it may not be successful. And so resilience has nothing to do with a positive outcome. And building it is really about the capacity to tolerate distress, which I think is a lot harder for some of our students. The ability to stay in and with a tough, challenging moment and to persist, even if the student doesn't have like confirmation of achievement or pending success. I view resilience as that space before a win, before a good grade, before an accolade. And research will tell us that an important force in the development of qualities like grit or resilience or growth mindset is stress plus support, which I think we as parents and mental health professionals are working hard on. And it's a hard balance to allow the stress, provide the just right amount of support, and make sure the stress is coming from the right place. What I don't think is a part of success necessarily is happiness. And that may sound a bit contradictory. I worry about equating success with happiness in that it can compel us as parents to solve our children's problems rather than equipping them to solve their own. And I think we saw a lot of this in the documentary. And we want to send the message that our children can handle that stress, that we can turn them towards it and say, hey, I'm here to support you and you've got this. So I feel like success is not about feeling happy, but it's about the ability to feel everything.
Very, very well said that, I am really glad that you brought this perspective of, how there are different parts to looking at success, right? And resilience and grit and that kind of combination of right amount of stress and support is so important to kind of let that flourish. Thank you, Renee. My next question is for our mental health therapist at CMS, Jen. What role should schools play in protecting students' mental health?
So I think in general, the first thing that comes to mind is recognizing, highlighting, and celebrating different facets of success, not just academic success or athletic success or these sorts of things, but as Dr. Pyle was saying, rewarding hard work and rewarding that grit and rewarding and really highlighting how hard a child has worked to maybe not get first place, but to even try and stick with it, I think is really, really important in sort of supporting that stress and just like this culture of success that kids are so oriented to, especially in our area. I think normalizing the experience of stress and providing space in school to have that conversation, whether that be a class discussion or having mental health professionals on site where kids can talk to someone about it and not feel like there's something wrong with them or they're the only one experiencing stress. I think there's a lot of power in connection and normalization of peers realizing that other peers are in the same boat and it's not always a competition. We are in this together. We're on the same team, I think more than our kids sometimes realize. Yeah, I think the last thing is sort of providing that sort of safety net for kids. I know I've used software. We have used software such as like Gaggle or things that will catch things in assignments or kids sort of in an email or sharing things where it'll catch it and it'll prompt them actually to check in with a mental health professional where they might not have sought out that help themselves. So having those resources available to students, I think makes a really, really big difference and helps to normalize that experience as well.
Thank you, Jen. I liked everything you said, but I particularly liked the main point of normalizing the stress, normalizing some of the anxiety that kids often face. That's actually so powerful. Like, you know, in my work with kids who I'm helping with kind of dealing with anxiety, often I try to remind them that don't get anxious about being anxious. Like that loop of, you know, like, oh, am I the odd one, or why am I worried about this so much? And it's like, yeah, the situation seems like it's stressful and it's a little bit, you know, normal to feel worried about XYZ right now. So I think that is so important. And then having that kind of open conversation about it, having peers who can, you know, share that, having that kind of supportive environment where this is not considered to be a taboo, but a topic that you can talk openly and share and get support is so important. And I think school can definitely provide that. So thank you so much. Now we have a question for our, you know, expert of the expert, Dr. Glenn Elliott. What is the value of free play and free time? As a child psychiatrist, what would you say how it affects the child's mental health?
It's a great question. It's an area that clinicians and researchers many decades ago who first began looking at childhood thought a lot about and concluded that play is what children do, is the equivalent of work for the children. It's their job to use their imagination, to interact with other people. Even in the trailer, you saw a lot of kids were playing together, and learning to play together and by yourself are both very important and need to be encouraged. There's less research about sort of what the role of or how what transfers into play as you get older, when you reach middle school and when you reach high school. And certainly the early researchers didn't have to think about things like social media and other kinds of things. But one thing I thought was missing that I think is very important, and we realized more and more, a crucial thing that happens in middle school and high school ages is interactions with other adults besides your parents. And things like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and a variety of other social organizations, and soccer and other as kind of sports, help kids learn that their parents are one opinion, and that there are other adult opinions that they can model themselves after. I didn't mention, I have two sons. They're now well into adulthood, but I'm also having the pleasure of watching my two grandchildren, who are 7 and 4.5, just about 7 and 4.5. And one of the neat things that their parents do is not only have the very rich play environment in their home, but also interact with them when the kids want them to, so that they really, my son literally reads to both kids every night, and that's a much better example than I ever did as a dad at that age. So several people have already touched on it. What's happening is that kids are learning some self-confidence. They're learning what happens when their best friend betrays them and they have to get over that. They're learning what happens when they try something and fail. Just earlier this week, my 4.5-year-old granddaughter did a trick on a trampoline that she'd done every time, apparently successfully for hundreds of times, but when showing off to grandpa, she fell down. And her pride was hurt, fortunately not her body. And that's a part of growing up. It's what Renee was talking about. You have to deal with emotions besides being happy. There was a period, you may remember, when California pushed self-esteem as the end all and be all. And it is important to help kids develop self-esteem, but it has to be a valid form of self-esteem. And that means dealing with failure as well as success.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for touching on some of those important kind of aspects of free play. And then, yes, self-esteem is not just about high self-esteem, focusing on what you can do well, but also working on what you can improve, having that growth mindset. So thank you, Glenn. My next question is for our principal, Jean, or actually she's a mother today, so let's not confuse her, her kind of her with her other hat that she normally wears. So, Jean, what do you think? Where does most of the stress, pressure, and fear come from in our community here? Do you think it's from parents? Is it kids themselves? Is it the school, the culture around us? What's your general kind of perspective on that?
It's a great question. And I think about the stories that I have heard from all of our families, including my own personal friends and families. And typically it's all around. Their stories typically begin with people say, or I heard, or I feel. And when the stories begin with this, then there's that sense of, oh, I'm not doing what they're doing. And I think that creates this swirling storm of added pressure, because you don't feel like you're doing it in this particular way, so you must be doing it wrong. And so that's why I feel it's so important to continue to have this forum where individuals can openly share their personal experiences and lean on each other in terms of sitting back and thinking, who am I as a parent, and who is my child as an individual? And what is it that my child needs to be successful? And so I will use myself as an experience with my own son embarking on what is supposed to be the college journey of his junior year. As a mother, I see my child do things a little bit differently, in which now I am thinking to myself, maybe my child needs to go through the community college route, for himself, and that might be better for him. And me as a mother, as an educator, saying, you know what, this is not about me, this is about my child, and how do I support that and push that pressure of, oh, your child's not applying to a UC school or something of that. Your child's going to go to community college, and understanding that that is okay. That is an option, because that is maybe what is best for my child. Now, could something change 3 months down the line? Yes. And so I think that when the question is asked about stress, pressure, and fear, I think a lot of it is just in what we are hearing and what we're presuming is supposed to be the way, when maybe it's not the way, and it's okay to say that.
I am so glad to hear that kind of perspective, Jean. I think it is so important for many parents, in the community, that it's okay that I don't have to follow this cookie cutter approach that, oh, if 10 other kids in my child's class are applying to Ivy League schools or are striving, to get to this popular brand school, that's what my child needs to do. There is a lot of peer influence, and what I see in my work is that, even though parents are saying, it's okay, like it's okay if you went to an average school or a junior college and then transferred, but because there's so much of discussion about this between kids, they breathe in and out the stress of like, where do I stand compared to this person, and they kind of start putting more pressure on themselves. But as parent, I have caught myself many times that I'm getting caught up in this rat race. Like I have to bring myself back, because every now and then I'll hear my daughter's friend is doing XYZ. She's going to this conference this weekend to present. She has papers that she's writing. She's, doing this research that's cutting edge. And I'm like, okay, well, I can't fathom how much they have to do at just like age 16 or 15 to prove themselves. And they're just trying to kind of show that I'm better than the other, or my application will look more attractive if I start a nonprofit. I mean, like, I am just I just don't know where we are going to go with this when 15, 16-year-olds are going to start nonprofits and startups and then make other people feel like they are worthless. I mean, that's kind of the message that people get, right? And that's where we get caught into this race. And part of me thinks that somehow this culture has changed. Who brought in is not a question, whether it is parents or certain individuals, or high achieving parents, or the schools, or how the world is evolving. I think we need to think about this as a problem for every child in our community. And unless and until we change our perspective and we come in confidently and say, hey, I am fine with my child going to junior college and then figuring it out later on, and be comfortable with it, not feel like, oh, I'm the odd one. How do I kind of show my face in front of the community that my child, who I'm supposed to be this educator or this psychiatrist or whatever prestigious kind of title I have, that my child has to fit that prestige trophy and get me that prestige trophy, and say, oh yeah, I need to do everything to kind of keep up. So I'm really, really very happy to hear that you were able to share that so comfortably. And I think that's what we all need to do. We need to look at our own child, their strengths and weaknesses, and kind of figure out what's right for them, and not just kind of follow the whole herd, kind of wherever everybody's going, I'm going to just keep going in that direction.
And what I might add, I have, one of the things that I think about is the added pressure, I guess an image, if anything, coming from social media, and this new term that, that our children are talking about in terms of an influencer and what that means. And I think that it's new. It's still relatively new, very young. and not enough information or research to show the effects of this new, if you will, career as an influencer, and what kind of pressure that brings. So this is something that I think about and wonder about, and wanted to share that with all of you. That this is something that I'm thinking about, because this word is becoming more prevalent. And I'm beginning to see our children use it.
Yeah, Glenn, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the school point. I had the advantage of being able to look backwards. Both of my children, in context, my wife and I were both super achievers and would do anything for an A. Neither of my children were like that in high school. And both of them ended up going to junior college. And probably the hardest decision my wife and I made during their adolescence was saying, if they're not really wanting to get A's in school, we can't make them do that. One of them now has a very steady job as a software engineer, and the other one is actually a child and adolescent psychiatrist. So we don't know where they're going to go, and pushing them, the idea of pushing a string comes to mind. Pushing them doesn't really work very well. Leading the way, giving them opportunities, I think is great. But the reality is that ultimately the motivation has to come from within.
Absolutely, absolutely agree with that. So my next question is for Sarah. What issues from the film seem most similar to ones our community is kind of managing?
So I think one issue that really stood out to me in the beginning was this pressure to excel and this hyper focus on academic achievement. And we know that success comes in many different ways. There's different ways of looking at success, and just the effects of this pressure to excel. We know that anxiety is what causes anxiety sometimes can be this focus on the future and thinking about the future, and I think that we're seeing that kids are experiencing a lot more anxiety when it comes to thinking about the future. And I think definitely our community, prioritizes, success in life, their success in life. And that could look like thinking about college, thinking about their futures and things like that. And another issue that I've kind of seen within our community, or even as just growing up in this community, is just, being overscheduled and not having enough downtime. And that adds to that pressure, it adds to the stress. And I think that it's something that we're still managing. I think it's great that we're having these conversations, because the big difference between when I was a teenager in school versus now is that the adults are talking about it, students are talking about it, and are being more vocal. And it's just been so great to see that change, that positive change, and having these discussions as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think when we heard Manuela saying the first few words that came to her after watching the film, it was like sadness and emptiness. Yes, it does jolt you because it raises this real questions about what has happened, where have we come, but at the same time, I think it's encouraging that there is recognition and awareness of this stuff happening, and we are able to do events like this to talk about it and converse, and that's kind of a first step towards bringing the change. So I'm glad that you're seeing some of that, Sarah. Thanks for pointing that out. So Renee, how has the pandemic changed your thoughts about what our kids need to be well? I think the pandemic was a very interesting time. None of us thought we will ever be in such a kind of phase of life. As a mental health professional, of course, I learned a lot. I'm sure as parents and whatnot, we all learned a lot of things. What's your perspective of what do you think the kids really need to be well?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I don't feel like the pandemic necessarily really changed my thoughts about what children need to be well, but I feel like it really highlighted what is most fundamental and important. Number one, I feel like, is sleep, honestly. If you're a parent of a middle schooler or a high schooler, I know that I am speaking to people that are probably nodding their head. I sometimes won't work with a child in my practice if sleep isn't under control, because I won't be effective. So sleep, exercise, and connection with nature. Those are usually the top three things in any good book or article about emotional health, both of adults and children. Just for our kind of middle school crowd out there, American Academy of Pediatrics recommends between 9 to 12 hours of sleep each night for children between the ages of 6 and 12. And then I think it's between like 8 and 10 for 13 and over. I heard Sarah and Jen both talk about downtime. And so I wanted to highlight that a little bit more. There's an organization locally called Challenge Success that really addresses well the question about how we define success, what we need to help children to kind of feel well. The work was generated in response to a really alarming increase in anxiety and depression and disengagement among students across the US. And so they gathered these experts in child and adolescent well-being and put together a really coordinated approach to helping schools and families develop different models of success that are better aligned with research on healthy child development. So I'll leave you with the PDF model from Challenge Success. So this PDF acronym is the kind of special sauce for well-being. P is playtime. This means, and this documentary highlighted it so well, unstructured time for social interactions and playing. This is recreation. This does not mean the 5 o'clock soccer. This does not mean the 4:30 Taekwondo lesson. Fun, recreation. This is the play that Dr. Elliott described. This is the language of our children. So that's P. D is downtime. And this is time set aside separate from structured activities or academics. This is relaxation, this is rest. This may be when your child is reading a graphic novel that is well below their reading level. That's great downtime. This may mean listening to music. This could be a little bit of screen time, and I'm usually okay with it in moderation. And then the F is family time. This is what brings our kids back home, creates that sense of connection, belonging. There's so much research on the importance of family time. This is where our kids feel supported, safe, loved unconditionally. It has huge impacts in self-esteem and academic outcomes. So Challenge Success would say shoot for 20 minutes, 5 days a week. That's the goal. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention all of the research on chores. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of all the best research on how to raise an adult, how to help children develop successfully. It's all the same thing. They'll either say chores and love, or they'll either say like structure and warmth. So chores, they're really important.
I am so delighted to hear that you are highlighting some of the key life skills that our kids need to also learn, right? We have become so focused on, which college they will go to, what degree are they going to get, what kind of career path is going to be looking like for them. We get them there, and unfortunately I see this in my work, like all the parents were like driving them places, they were getting the food done, they were doing their laundry, and then kid goes to college and they are struggling to live there because now doing chores is twice as harder, along with managing living independently, getting along with the roommate, doing all the other academic demand, keeping up with all the academic demands in a college setting. So very, very important for all of us to remember that instead of overscheduling them and signing up them for multiple activities, let's also give them some downtime and give them some work at home. I'm mindful of the time. I know we did start a few minutes later, so we'll continue with a couple more questions. My next question is for Jen. Jen, the film makes the case that typical childhood has changed significantly over the last few decades. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. I think I have somewhat of a unique perspective here where the peak of my late childhood was only about 20 years ago. So I grew up I had internet. I grew up with access to internet, but no social media. So it's kind of like that transition into, we couldn't use the phone at the same time as the internet, but we didn't have quick access on phones, on smartphones, access to anything at any time. And I think social media and modern internet, it kind of boils down what I've noticed to three main differences between my childhood and kids now, which is competition and comparison, where they are constantly comparing themselves to peers. This topic of FOMO, the fear of missing out and having access to what they're missing out on, live footage of what they're missing out on, and just it makes that concept so much worse. And I think the third thing is, I don't know if there's a term for this, but when I was growing up and you had a problem with someone at school, you go home and you forget about them. They don't have access to you anymore. You forget about it. You distract yourself. You hang out with someone else and it's fine. But now that problem follows you all day and all night and through the night, and you can't necessarily get rid of that person because everyone is so interconnected. And in order to get a break from it, you kind of have to take a break from all of your connections. Kids are really isolated without having that or they feel isolated without having that constant connection. So I think Jean was kind of right on the nose when she brought up the social media being a big difference in childhood now versus just 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Very true. I think that digital footprint that kind of stays when somebody gets bullied or some, like you said, when you and I were growing up, I'm much older than you, but when I was growing up, there was no concept of social media. If there was something that happened at the school, we would forget it, by the end of the day. But now there is somebody taking a picture or putting a video and posting it, and then it's spreads like fire, and people who didn't witness it also look at it and they know this person was caught in some kind of embarrassing situation, and it just very difficult. I think there's advantages to social media, but there are a lot of these downsides that I think definitely add to the stress and have changed the childhood for our kids, our digital kids, a lot. In interest of time, I'm going to keep moving to the next question. Next question is for.
You're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I muted myself by mistake. I'm sorry. So, I think we saw this statement also highlighted during the trailer when we saw that earlier before starting the questions. So in the trailer, Julia Lythcott-Himes talks about pressure and expectations that society, school, and parents put on children, and makes this very powerful statement: when we mortgage our kids' childhood, it's a debt that we can never be repaid. How do you feel about this statement? And I want you to maybe answer that first, and I have one more question follow up to that.
Sure. I think in some ways it's not a particularly great analogy, but it does feel like mortgage in the sense that we've chosen to do things like academics and activities and a variety of other things that have been described in place of what we've described as really essential to childhood. And that's what can't be replaced. You can't suddenly develop an imagination if you've never been allowed to do that, or suddenly develop independence. My almost 7-year-old grandson goes to school a block and a half away from where we live. And his parents decided last week to let him actually walk from the school over to our place. Granted, his mother had considerable trepidation about that, but we'd all agreed on it. They practiced. He'd made the walk several times, did it just fine. The amount of criticism that she's taken from other parents and teachers, it just baffles me. That he, of course, came very proud. I did it and everything was just fine. So I think it's more a matter of missed opportunities. If we overvalue academics to the exclusion of these other things, that can't be made up later.
Thank you for actually, bringing a different perspective to that. I think, yeah, you're very much right on that. We can't just go with that as a blanket statement and say, oh, we are all, going to repent later and feel like, oh, we did something terribly wrong. But it's really that it's all about the balance is what it comes down to. I have one more question. Again, as a mental health professional, we were, talking about how there've been a higher rate of anxiety and depression. We're seeing really record rates of these problems in children and teens in the past 5 years, at least, or past couple years for sure, even more so. Would you agree that those might be related to how the world has changed for our kids, or is that just being more recognized and that's why we are seeing those as higher numbers?
Well, it's a great question. The observation, I think, is absolutely solid. There's lots and lots of evidence that really across the United States that's happening. In some ways, I was actually grateful that the film took place on the East Coast mostly, and not here in the Silicon Valley, because it's nice to know that other places have similar kind of problems. But I would disagree with Renee a little bit in that I think the pandemic has had a significant impact on that as well. I think families having to crowd together, parents suddenly having to be both employed and also teaching, the failure to have the opportunity, just lots of milestones that got missed. I think we're going to be seeing that wave is going to be fascinating to watch as they get older. Just think of the juniors and seniors who didn't get to do all of the things that we expect juniors and seniors to be able to do. There are so many different factors. I mean, you could blame TikTok. There are the number of ways in which kids are being bombarded by information. The earlier mention of influencers. Usually we think of peers. One of the huge changes actually from 30 years ago is that we typically think of peers as supportive of development. And I think that's still generally true, but as was just talked about, the constant availability and rapid spread of rumors and innuendos and insults is, I think, also a major contributing factor as well. And that combination, I mean, I try to imagine what the pandemic would have been like if we didn't have Zoom and social media and other kinds of things like that. It's really impossible to think about what society would have done under those circumstances, but it had its consequences. And I think we're going to be paying for those for a number of years. And I think some kids may pay for it, much of their lives.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm looking at the clock. Anuja, how are we doing? I have a couple more questions, but we can also wrap it up if it seems like we are, out of time.
Sure. I think if we can do maybe like 1 or 2 more questions and then wrap it up, since we did start a little late, and I seems like all the parents and the viewers are, really enjoying this session and the perspectives. So if you're okay with that, we can do a couple more questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that grace time. I'm definitely really happy to see a lot of parents engaged, and I'm seeing some questions coming through in the chat box. I'm sorry, I'm trying to kind of stay on track and trying to moderate. So I may not be able to get to those questions right away, but I will make a point to try and email you or find a way to get the answers later on. So, the next set of questions, actually, I'll open it up to both our parents who are representing as parents. We have a lot of parents in the group. But Shruti and Manula, I wanted to kind of get your perspective on how might we begin to change our community, and what's one personal commitment to change that you are willing to make based on kind of the discussion we are having tonight. So you can take turns or open it up to both of you and talk about your thoughts about that.
Okay, I'll jump in, and Shruti, please jump in whenever you want to. In terms of the first part of that, like how do we move on from here? I think that it starts with awareness, and here we are tonight, and this is a fantastic start. I can't help but think that we are to some extent preaching to the choir, and that the parents that we have here tonight are the ones that already subscribe to a lot of these ideas. But that's okay, because you don't change anything without first being aware of it and acknowledging that there is something to change about it. And then from that point, I think it's advocate, educate, and model, as with everything. I think that doing whatever you can at your level of access or your level of influence is perfect. And that's how we impart change. That's how we get to the new and better world that we all wish for ourselves and for our kids. In terms of specifically this quest for perfection and this ideal of one form of success, speaking from a parent perspective, since that's the hat that I'm wearing tonight, I think one very important aspect of it, and Dr. Kanzodi, you touched on this with your own experience, I think, is that we really have to be okay with more than one outcome. And we can't just say it. We have to really be okay with that, because our actions speak volumes. They actually say much more than our words could ever impart to our children. And so if we say, oh, I don't care about grades, and we proceed to check parent view every day, our kids see this, our kids pick up on this. And so we could spend hours spewing messages of encouragement. If that's not how we feel, that's not how we're going to act. And hence, that's not what they're going to understand from their own parents. I think that another crucial thing is to invite our kids to the conversation as we think about what we hope and wish for the next steps in their lives. Let them participate in also sharing what they hope and wish, because I feel like children can be so insightful and bring such important perspectives into the conversation that never even occurred to us. And that will help to shape outcomes that will feel like successes to everyone. And then last but not least, I invite everyone to read How to Raise an Adult, because it's an amazing book. And if you haven't started to dip your toes there, do. And I'll stop there.
Very, very well said, Manuela. And I'm going to piggyback on that in terms of the kids kind of being part of the conversation. Because in my mind, I think it's what we've all said, how we define success, and this whole thing of not comparing yourself with others. I think to me, that is the biggest thing. Each one of us is unique. So success for me might be different from success for you. and what comes from within each moment for each person is different. So I think if we just align not just our children, but ourselves with our truth at any given moment, easier said than done, but it's something that I continuously aspire towards. And after the film, one thing which I did put as a personal thing for myself was the Let Grow project, because in terms of trying to help these children, like, okay, I'll do this, or I'll drop you there, or whatever. I think giving a little more independence is something that I need to learn as a parent. And just, you can go there by yourself, or you can, so that's going to be my, that was definitely my takeaway from the film, because I think my kids are ready for a little more independence.
Makes total sense. So I think we have to let go to let grow, right? We have to definitely try to, let go, and, if you're worried about them failing or falling, let them have that experience and learn from that and grow. I think that's another thing. I think this overprotective parenting that we have gotten into, where we are like, the mama bear in all of us comes and it's like, no, I want to fix it. My child, it shouldn't be falling. They shouldn't have any sadness, any grief about anything. I should try and make everything perfect for them so they are always happy. And I think we have gone a little bit too far on that end, and that's what we are seeing is affecting our kids' mindset. And that's why we have to keep reminding ourselves to, like, if we can have growth mindset ourselves, we can allow that happen for our kids too. Thank you, Manuela and Shruti, for sharing those really good kind of takeaways. We are coming to the last question that I had on my list, and that's for Jean Wang. What support do you need to be part of the process towards change?
And I think I felt like this was an underlying message throughout the evening, which was, the first thing I want to say is I grew up in this area. So I am a product of this district. And I feel that the community we have is extremely supportive. It's very easy to ask for help and receive help. I think we absolutely need to continue these opportunities to have these conversations, continue to have forums, and people are able to share their stories and their experiences. I think that it's not just for us, but for our students to be able to speak to each other and share their experiences with each other. I envision our CMS alum students coming back from high school to share their experiences with the students. So they get that firsthand information versus an adult telling them that has been out of high school for some time. I think to be able to continue to have these types of conversations is helpful. I think it brings all of us together. I think it allows for us to share individual experiences and see personalities and see character traits and think, well, maybe this will help my child. It's always worth a shot.
Very, very well said, Jean. And, I think that's I think a big kind of message that you're sharing, that, when I'm trying to be a little bit out of the box, if the box is like, the norm is like, everybody's like over scheduled, everybody's kid is enrolled in 10 things. And then I feel like, am I being not the right kind of parent? Am I being, like too easy on my child? Maybe I need to put them in this class or that class. And so I get pulled into that. Or if I'm choosing, no, that's not for my child. I know that might be good for them, but they're not even interested. So if I come out of that box and I make that decision for me and my child, I think it is still a dilemma that I feel often as a parent. Am I doing the right thing? But when I find a like-minded community and we come and talk to somebody else and say, this is how I feel, and this is why I made this decision for my child, and somebody validates that and supports that and says, yeah, I would do the same, or I think this is a great perspective to have, or this is okay to do, I think that makes, the individual feel much more supported and feel like they can keep going on in this kind of other direction, or be a little bit out of the box and kind of have their own way of bringing that change. And, I think we always think about this needs to change at a like a community level, but it can start with one person, and everything starts with one. And if we get more similar kind of support, similar thinking, or a kind of, if we are creating a culture where it's like, okay, yeah, maybe we've come too far, let's take a step back and come in the middle. That's kind of what I think this documentary tried to kind of invoke in all of us, that I can just sit and say and blame the system and blame the culture, blame whatever I can, and say this is why I'm doing this, because this is how the system works. But if I have recognized and built that awareness that there is some change that the system needs, and if I can start bringing that change and bring more people to support bring that change, then the change will happen. So that's kind of what my, I guess, takeaway was from this movie or this film, that we can't just sit and say, okay, this is how it is, and just kind of go with the flow. But maybe it's time for us to, be that person who can bring that change, and such conversations and these types of events can really support us to do that. So thank you again for letting us bring this film and having this rich discussion. Over to you, Anuja.
Thank you again. I just want to wrap this up quickly because I know we've kind of overstayed our time, but I really appreciate all of you being here tonight, this evening with us to have this conversation. And as Dr. Kanzode and many of the panelists have said, it's the awareness. We need the awareness, and we need to have conversations like this to kind of create change in our community. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's small steps, little things we can each do ourselves that'll benefit the community and our children. So just wanted to say thank you on behalf of the CMS PTO to our wonderful panelists. Thank you for carving out some time this evening to have this important conversation with our community. We're truly grateful. And last but not least, I would just like to reach out to our community saying that events like this are sponsored by the PTO, and your generous donations help us bring events like this. So if you haven't donated yet, please do so. I'm just going to add the link to the chat. And again, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you again. And I have just put our link for Taarika Foundation. If people are curious what we do, you can find that. Even on the film event page, there was a little bit of an intro for when you click on About and click on the Taarika tab, it will allow you to see what work we do. So again, thanks a lot. Really, really thankful to all our esteemed panelists, and have a good night. Thank you everyone for staying extra few minutes. Have a good night.
Thank you.